Okay, so we're going to do three things today in this short time. The first thing we're going to do is just reflect on a rationale for cultivating virtue in Catholic education. I think we probably understand this already, but there are a few things I want to say about it that, I don't know, maybe you've heard before, maybe you haven't. So we're just going to reflect on why this is important. Why are we doing this? It's not just another initiative. It's not a fad. It's something that's integral to Catholic education. We're also going to identify ways in which we're already fostering virtue. You probably do this already, so it's not like you have to reinvent everything. You're probably doing this already. And so what you really probably just need to think about, and this is our third thing, is realigning our language and practice to foster education and virtue. So thinking about the things we already do, thinking about the practices, the habits that you practice as a school community, as a teacher, as an educator, and then just aligning your current practice to language and to other habits that foster virtue. So those are the three things we're going to do today, and we're going to continue to think about that as we go forward from this session, and I'll give you a way to do that at the end. All right, well, I'm a big C.S. Lewis fan. I don't know if you've read any C.S. Lewis. He wrote the Narnia Chronicles. He wrote one of my favorite books, Mere Christianity. And in that book, Mere Christianity, he has this line, which I love. He says, "We might think that God wants obedience to a set of rules, but really what he wants is people of a particular kind, people of a particular sort." Now, you can't become that kind of person without adhering to a certain set of norms and rules, right? In the same way that if I want to be a healthy person, there are things I have to do to be a healthy person. I can't just say, well, I want to be healthy and then not do the things that a healthy person does, right? But the point of doing those things is to become a particular kind of person. So have this idea in your mind, this quote in your mind as we go, because it's really behind everything we're going to say. I love this quote from Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. He put it the same idea. He put this way: that the glory of God is the human person fully alive. And what we really want is for our students to live full lives, to be fully alive, to be the person that God calls them to be. And in doing so, they will reveal the glory of God to the world. So I love that. I love that quote. All right. Well, if you ask a lot of Catholic educators what what makes Catholic education unique, my own kid's school is going through the accreditation process right now. In fact, the visiting team is there today with the school. And so we had a dinner last night with some of the parents, and my wife and I had the chance to join. And they asked us, what do you do that you think makes your school unique? And if you've been on an accreditation visit, you ask that question, everyone pretty much says the same thing, right? And it doesn't mean they're insincere, but there are a lot of things that Catholic schools tend to do well. And one of those is that they said, well, we form the whole person. And that's true. You find this language all over the place. In fact, it's in your mission statement, right? It's very common to have in Catholic school mission statements. I happen to look on your website and it's in there. But I want to reflect on what we mean by this. And this is important because even a lot of public schools say that they form the whole person. Everyone thinks they form the whole person. No one thinks they form half of a person, right? You don't go to a Catholic school or public school and say, what do you do? And you say, well, we really only form part of a person. The rest we just kind of leave up to chance. So for example, a school district in New Jersey defines what they mean by whole person when they say that it refers to the student's social, emotional, and academic growth. Weston Public Schools in Massachusetts say that it refers to academics, extracurriculars, emotional intelligence, resilience, and well-being. Mountain View here in California just wants to keep kids safe. That's what they mean by fostering the whole child. That's a pretty low bar, but there it is. And also in California, Los Gatos says that the whole child refers to the academic, social, emotional, and physical person. Even Berkeley Public Schools say that they meet the needs of the whole child. So what do we mean when we say this? And we'll come back to this in a moment. I saw this a few years ago. One of my kids was doing karate for like 2 weeks. He doesn't do it anymore. But I was really impressed by this. And I thought, you know what, if we could get something like this in all of our Catholic schools, this would be great. This was not a Christian karate dojo. This was just, a standard karate place. And I love that they call their, their root beliefs a creed. At the beginning of the session, the sensei would ask the students to stand, and he would say, "And now we will recite the creed." And I was like, wow, this sounds kind of familiar, right? And they also had these habits, which are really virtues. In fact, some of them are literal virtues that we'll talk about. But my favorite there is indomitable spirit. And I was like, wow, they get what they're doing. I love that language. They own it, they say it, and it's winsome. I love that. So we need to be as clear as we can, because there are a lot of institutions that are doing this articulation of what we're doing, maybe even better. I'll just come back to C.S. Lewis again, and this is I won't read this whole thing, but I'll just sort of sum it up for you. This is from an essay he wrote called "Man or Rabbit," and in this essay he says, look, Christianity proposes that human beings will live forever, and a materialist worldview, one that doesn't think that they will live forever, thinks they live for 70 years or so, and if that's true, then happiness in this life will mean something very different than what it means for someone who thinks that we live forever, right? And he says, now there are quite a lot of things in which these two people, a materialist and someone who believes we live forever, could agree in doing for their fellow citizens. For example, both would approve of efficient sewers and hospitals and a healthy diet. But sooner or later, the difference in their belief about the person would produce differences in their practical proposals. Both, for example, might be very keen about education, but the kinds of education they want people to have would obviously be very different. And all the time, one great difference would run through their whole policy. A Christian, or somebody who believes we live forever, and a materialist hold different beliefs about the universe and about the human person. They can't both be right. The one who is wrong will act in a way which simply doesn't fit the real universe. And consequently, even with the best will in the world, they will be helping their fellow creatures to their destruction. So this is what's at stake here when we talk about formation, when we talk about education, and when we talk about our students becoming the people that they're made to be. I'll give you an example of this. I love the Olympics. The Olympics are on right now. I don't know if you've been watching them. We've been watching them every night as a family. I love the Olympics. Kind of more of a Winter Olympics person than a Summer Olympics. But this is a photo from the Tour de France from the early 20th century. And you can see in this picture that all of these cyclists are smoking. And it's not just because they're French. They're smoking because at that time, they believed that smoking was actually healthy for your lungs and that it opened up your lung capacity. Doctors used to prescribe cigarettes to people. Like if you had asthma, they'd prescribe cigarettes, which is crazy. Like that's the first thing your doctor asks you today. It's like the first question on the questionnaire, like, you don't smoke, do you? Right. And I'm going to guess that, so this is a picture right before they were going into the mountain stage, and knowing that they would have to breathe harder, they all start passing around cigarettes in the mountain before they get to the mountains because they thought it would help them breathe better. And I'm going to guess, I mean, there are other factors here, technology, training regimens, all of that. But their ability to flourish as a cyclist in the mountain stage was probably diminished because of this. And the point here is that they believed something incorrect about human flourishing, and it affected their ability to flourish. It affected one of their practices, one of their habits. And they did not do as well as they could have, right? And this is a silly example, but this is why the things that we do, the habits that we practice, need to be aligned to what we believe about the human person, because that's how we're going to flourish. So coming back to this idea of the whole child, what does it mean to form the whole child? This is from a talk from Archbishop Michael Miller, who used to be the head of the Congregation for Catholic Education at the Vatican. And he says, Catholic theology teaches that grace builds on nature, right? Grace builds on nature. Because of this complementarity of the natural and supernatural, Catholic educators should have a sound understanding of the human person that addresses the requirements of both the natural and the supernatural perfection of the children entrusted into their care. Repeatedly, the Holy Sees, meaning the Church's documents, emphasize the need for an educational philosophy built on a correct understanding of who the human person is. Another document on Catholic education says every type of education is influenced by a concept of what it means to be a person. You saw that in some of the mission statements and definitions of the whole person that I showed you, even from public schools. It says in today's world, the Catholic educator must consciously inspire his or her activity with the Christian concept of the person. Catholic educators can be certain then that they make human beings more human, right? So Catholic education is also about making human beings more human. It's about the glory of God being the human person fully alive. And this is one reason the Church establishes schools, because she considers them a privileged means of promoting the formation of there's that phrase, whole person, since the school is a center in which a specific concept of the world and of the person and of history is developed. So we have this understanding of what it means to be a person, right? Informed, of course, by the incarnation, informed by the fact that God became a human being. As the Second Vatican Council says, in becoming one of us, Jesus not only reveals God to us, he reveals us to us, which is a beautiful line. And so that concept of the person needs to permeate all the things that we do. And that's why virtue formation is so important. Skip that there. So you might be familiar with the national standards and benchmarks for effective Catholic elementary and secondary schools, or the NESBECs, right? These are integrated into the WCEA accreditation process. And they have a set of 9 defining characteristics for Catholic schools. So they use this phrase, whole child or whole person, but they define what they mean by it. So notice what's different about this from the ones that I showed you earlier. They say, and this is a quote from a document from the Congregation for Catholic Education called The Catholic School from 1977. Catholic school education is rooted in the conviction that human beings have a transcendent destiny. There's that idea of living forever, right? That education for the whole person must form the spiritual, intellectual, physical, psychological, social, moral, aesthetic. I love that word aesthetic because it means beauty is not optional. Beauty is an attribute of God. It's something we're made for. And so it needs to be part of our formation. And of course, religious capacities of each child. So we need to understand what we mean by whole person, because everyone thinks they do that. And it's important we all understand this together, because this is, as this document goes on to say, what gives us all authority to teach. It says it's therefore essential, if for no other reason than a unity in teaching, that each member of the school adopts a common vision, a common outlook based on adherence to a scale of values in which we believe. And this is what gives us authority to educate, right? Our mission is not ours. We step into a mission that belongs to the church, that belongs to Christ, and we use our gifts and talents in service of that mission. So to come back to this idea, the whole point here is, again, we might think God wants obedience to a set of rules, but what he really wants is people of a particular sort, the glory of God being the human person fully alive. Okay. So that's the first part. That's a little bit of the rationale here, right? I think you probably understand all of that already. So let's go on to say a little bit here about the virtues, and then we'll jump into some of the practical pieces. So as you know, a virtue is a habit. A virtue is not an individual action. The virtues are things that we do that become sort of second nature, right? And C.S. Lewis has a good example of this in Mere Christianity. He says, you know, if you were playing tennis and you hit a perfect shot that was right on the line, or let's say you went up against one of the best tennis players in the world and you were going to try and return one of their, 100+ mile per hour serves, and you happened to get the racket on it and you returned it and it was right on the line and you scored a point. Would you say that that was a good tennis player? Well, maybe, but maybe they just got lucky, right? Maybe you just got lucky. You just sort of closed your eyes, stuck your racket out, and things went the way they should have. But if you can't repeat that, if that's not a habit, then it means you're not a good tennis player, right? In the same way that if you saw somebody at a basketball game, I almost said a Seattle Supersonics game. I'm so sorry. Is that still raw for some of you?
Yeah.
No? Okay. Yeah. Let's say you're at a basketball game. You know how they pull people onto the court and they're like, "Hey, hit a half-court shot to win a car." If you saw somebody do that, you might say, wow, they're really good. Or again, they might be lucky, right? But if they could repeat that, if it was a habit, if it was second nature, then then you could say, yes, they're very good. So a virtue is not just one thing we do. It's something we do repeatedly over time. It's a disposition that we have. And a disposition is a quality or character trait that develops about a person as a result of particular habits and built up actions, right? So you know this. This is what the virtues are. And of course, we have the cardinal and theological virtues. We won't go into this, but I want to say a word about this because I think this is important. This is a question that comes up a lot. So, you know, there are 4 cardinal virtues and 3 theological virtues, right? And as we said, that grace builds upon nature. So the theological virtues are given to us by God. They are not things that we develop all on our own, but they interact, you might say, and build upon the cardinal virtues, or what are sometimes called the human virtues. Cardinal virtues are things that we can acquire by ourselves through human effort. We do not need grace. We do not need the infusion of grace to practice the human virtues or cardinal virtues. And this is why someone like Aristotle, writing a couple hundred years before Christ, could talk about virtue and write a whole book called the Nicomachean Ethics, all about virtue, right? Even though he didn't know Christ, he knew what virtue meant. He knew what human flourishing meant to some degree, and recognized that you could practice virtue even without grace. The reason I bring this up is I think sometimes we think about virtue as this explicitly religious thing, that, you know, if we're gonna foster virtue, if we're gonna use the language, it might be a turnoff to some people. You know, roughly half of your families self-identify as Catholic in your school, and I would imagine you also have non-Catholics on staff. And so the good thing about the virtues and about fostering virtue is it's a good entry point for anyone, because again, 4 of the 7 virtues, principal virtues, you can practice just by human effort. They're things that everyone recognizes. Remember the image of the dispositions from the karate dojo, right? One of them was perseverance. That's a cardinal virtue, perseverance. So the cardinal virtues are a good entry point because they're things everyone sort of recognizes as habits of flourishing. And you don't have to be an explicitly religious person or a Catholic to recognize that. So in a community that wants to foster virtue, this is a good entry point, and it gives you a common language even for people who may not share the faith. So I just wanted to point that out. It's an important point. I'll share these slides with you, but here's some, again, here are all the virtues, and there's some links to information on them if you would like that. Again, just to show you how these are universal, this is actually a quote from secular educators, and they talk about dispositions. They're really talking about virtues. They don't use the language, but they're talking about the same thing. And they point out that dispositional goals characterize productive ways of thinking and acting, and these are known as habits of mind or virtues. Notice he uses the word habit. These are inherently transdisciplinary in nature, and they apply across subject matter and throughout life. Transdisciplinary means that they're applicable in a religion class, a math class, they're applicable on the field, on the court, everywhere, right? So again, this is not just an explicitly kind of religious vocabulary. Now you might say, well, okay, how do you assess or how do you observe virtue? You hear people sometimes say, well, you can't assess faith. I'm going to say, sure you can. You can assess the extent to which someone practices the elements of a faithful life, right? You can't see their heart, but you can see whether or not they do the things. Now, again, there can be disconnects there. Somebody can just be doing it on the outside. But this goes back to that point about if I can't be a healthy person unless I'm doing those things, I can't be a faithful person unless I'm also doing the things that faith requires. And so what does assessing virtue look like, or assessing dispositions? They say it looks like asking, what does it look like when a student is listening with empathy, or persevering through a difficult math problem, or doing the things you're writing on your Post-it notes right now? We can best assess dispositions or virtues through a collected evidence model of observations compiled over time. I show you this quote because these are secular educators writing in just a textbook on assessment. to show you that assessing virtue is possible, and you probably do it already. Okay. What I want to go through now, and again, I'll share all of this with you, so you don't have to take pictures of the slides or write anything down, but I want to share 7 key drivers and then 7 core practices, all right? And as you're listening to these, I want you to be listening for things you're already doing that you can incorporate, where you can incorporate the language of virtue. So the 7 key drivers are areas of school life where the integration of virtue is maybe most seamless or kind of most evident. And then the practices are approaches or habits that you can implement in any of those 7 areas, okay? So the main one is language. Language, as a philosopher once said, is the house of meaning. It's the driver of culture. Remember that quote earlier that said, adopting a common vision is important for teachers, not just for utilitarian purposes, but it's because it's what drives culture. We can't have a shared mission. We can't have a shared school culture unless we're using the same language. And so the language of virtue is one of the main ways to really drive a culture of virtue formation. So paying attention to how you use language is really crucial. And I'll give you an example. And I hope like any of these examples, I've never been to your school, so I'm not picking on anyone. If you have something like this in your classroom, this is a suggested area of integration of virtue. But when we use words like character building, right, or things like that, that's fine. I think we know what we mean by that. But character building is certainly not Catholic language. It's a little vague. It's a little kind of general. It's a little secular, right? So anywhere we see that phrase character building, we want to maybe use the word virtue formation instead of character building, right? That's one example of attention to language. Another one might be something like talking about kindness as a value. Kindness is a value. Kindness is important, but it's also related to the virtue of justice. So before we talk about kindness, we might want to talk about the virtue of justice and then talk about kindness as an example of justice in practice, right? And ask kids, well, why is kindness, the practice of kindness, an example of justice? So we want to use language that reflects this formation. Any place you have language, right? That includes in student outcomes and signage everywhere. So that's the main thing, is language, focusing on language, being intentional about your language. In our student outcomes, when we have, a lot of schools have, whether you call them integrated student outcomes, whether you call them grad profiles, whether you call them, I was at a school that called them ESLERs, expected school-wide learning results, whatever they are, right? Build the language of virtue into all of your student outcome expectations. That includes in your syllabi, in individual class outcomes. Talk about in a math class how one of the expectations is that you're going to practice perseverance, right? You're going to practice industriousness. You're going to practice the virtue of justice by doing collaborative work together. So really being intentional about how you integrate that language in student outcomes, and of course in signage, in posters, in images, and wall space. Anytime you can replace an existing value or word with the language of virtue, the better, and you're aligning your linguistic culture together when you do that. Every single school communication, whether that's a newsletter, whether it's a school bulletin, whether it's an email to a parent, and I'll show you some examples of this in a moment, whether it's something on the calendar, every single school communication is an opportunity to foster culture, to push the culture forward, to invite people, whoever you're communicating with, especially if it's families, to participate in that culture, in that linguistic culture. And so every single school communication is an opportunity for virtue formation and culture, and virtue enculturation. So for example, if you notice that a lot of kids are being dropped off late to school, Nick might want to send an email to parents that says, we want to practice the virtue of justice by giving every student what's due to them. And so we want to remind everyone that being on time to school constitutes an act of justice. You might say something like that, right? It might sound silly, but I think that's a great example. So incorporating this into every communication and remembering that every communication is an opportunity for virtue formation, including of the parents. The parents need virtue formation just as much as the kids do, right? And the more that you can connect what's happening in the classroom and at the school to what's happening in the home, the better. Integration in every single subject. We mentioned this a little bit, right? Build it into your classroom expectations. Build your classroom expectations around at least the cardinal or human virtues, and give students, examples of what those look and sound like in practice, so that they know when they're being virtuous and when they're not. Build it into policies and procedures and discipline. Discipline is a great place to obviously bring students back to virtue. Instead of, maybe always pointing out when they're not being virtuous, give them affirmations. Talk about when they are being virtuous. Again, I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And then finally, in both parent and faculty formation. So I think the more that you're working and talking together about how you're doing this and about where the opportunities to integrate virtue are coming up, the better. Again, remember that parents need this formation too. And in fact, one of the standards from the NESBECs, it's standard 4, talks about the school as a place of adult formation. It talks about the importance of parent formation. We all talk a big game in Catholic education about how parents are the primary educators of kids. This is a place where we need to walk that talk, right? We need to be walking with parents and giving them what they need to educate their kids, because they are the primary educators. And one of the ways we can do that is through giving them language, by forming them in what virtue means. And you can do that in big ways by having a night about virtue. By talking about it at back to school night, by putting it into the documents that you send home, the notes you send home. And you can do it in very small ways by just intentionally putting something about virtue in any and all communication that goes to parents. So this is not all of them. Obviously, this doesn't cover everything in the life of the school, but all of these drivers pop up in every discipline and every aspect of school life, right? And so these are sort of the big buckets that I would look at for opportunities to really integrate virtue. Okay, now whatever area you're looking at, I want to go through 7 sort of habits or core practices to think about, and each of these applies really to each of those 7. Okay, so the first one is you have to be intentional about it. This is not going to happen by osmosis. It's not going to happen accidentally. It might happen accidentally, but again, if you want to be good at virtue integration, it has to be intentional. It has to become second nature, right? Doing it once, doing it twice, just like hitting a half-court shot, does not mean you're doing it well, or not mean you're good at it. It also has to become a virtue. It has to become a habit. So be intentional about it. When you're planning things, when you're writing out documents, when you're writing that email, ask yourself, how can I use this as an opportunity to foster virtue? The second is focusing, again, as we said, on language. You can do this everywhere. I've said enough about this, but this is a core practice that applies to every aspect of school life. The third is to make it measurable. One of the ways I like to do this, and this is I didn't come up with this, I stole this, is to talk about what virtue looks like and sounds like. And this is really good for kids. At the lower grades, you might want to use images, right? Or use pictures, post those around the room that talk about, the virtue of industriousness, and show somebody cleaning their desk or something like that. So the more you can make it measurable in terms of looks like and sounds like, the better. So I'll give you a little hint about where we're going with this. You wrote some things down on your Post-its, right? How do you make those things measurable? To what extent are each of those things measurable? How do you know those when you see them? What do they look and sound like in practice, right? And that's why we started with a verb, because it's the easiest thing. You can point to it. So the more you can make it measurable, build it into even assessments, the better. I would say build it into report cards, but when you start talking about report card structures, people start to freak out. So, but it's a good idea also. Look to the saints. The saints are great examples of lived virtue in action. And kids love talking about the saints. You know this. The more you talk about the saints are so winsome, and they're great examples of lived faith, but also lived virtue. And when you're talking about saints, ask the students to think about the faith of the saint, but also the virtues that they exhibit, right? What particular virtues does St. Carlo Acutis live? What particular virtues did St. Alphonsus live? And the saints provide that kind of looks like and sounds like for kids to reflect on. Steal from nuns. I'm going to give you some examples about this in just a second. So we'll come back to that. You already do all of this, right? As we said, you're probably already doing all the things we talk about. You use language, obviously. You measure student actions and activities. You talk about saints. Maybe you already steal from nuns. I don't know. But you're already doing this already. So this is not like some big heavy lift or initiative that we're being asked to do here. It just takes time to think about and revise the things we're doing and align the language we're using with the language of virtue. And the more you start to practice that intentionally, the more you'll see the places you're already doing it. Okay. And then finally, this is the most important piece. We have to be witnesses to virtue ourselves. One of the most terrifying parts of being a parent for me is that I know that my kids are always watching me. And that's terrifying because I am not always a model of virtue to them, right? Sometimes I get frustrated easily, I get impatient, all of that. And every time that happens, I'm showing them, I'm presenting to them, proposing to them a way to act in that particular circumstance, right? The most effective curriculum, the most effective text, you might say, the most effective lesson plan is you, the teacher, walking and talking. You are a walking witness to virtue. And so fostering virtue in yourself, practicing the habits of virtue is really important. And maybe even, at times you get impatient in the classroom. It's understandable. It happens. Acknowledging that to the kids. I apologize. I was not practicing the virtue of perseverance. I was not practicing the virtue of patience. What should I have done in this case, right? And they'll tell you, the kids will tell you, especially if you make this language habitual. All right, as Pope Paul VI said, modern people listen more willingly to witnesses than to teachers. And if we do listen to teachers, it is because they are witnesses. And so we evangelize primarily, we integrate, we form culture primarily by our conduct. And that's important to remember when it comes to virtue integration. You are the most effective lesson plan when it comes to virtue. Okay, so those are some practices. We're going to reflect a little more on that in a moment. What I want to do is give you some examples of, I said steal from nuns. Okay, here's where you can steal from some nuns. And I think they would be happy with that. I know most of you are probably familiar with virtues in practice. I can't see you very well because the screen is a little small in the corner of my screen. So can you just nod like in an exaggerated fashion if you're familiar with virtues in practice? Okay, good. Thank you very much for picking that up. Good. So this is great. And I'm not a vendor for any particular program. I don't represent anyone. I have some preferences of my own. My kids' school actually uses this one from the Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist in Ann Arbor, Michigan, because they created it. They have these sisters at their school, so they literally have, my kids' teachers have literally created the content for this. So this is the one I'm most familiar with, and I pointed out to you, not if you're not using it, it's not your primary source. That's fine. But I pointed out to you because they do have a lot of good examples of practices of a lot of good resources, some good videos around virtue. And these are just some examples. So this is one of the ones I was talking about. All of these fall under the virtue of justice, right? This is from a chart that you can download and buy from their website. It defines the virtue, and it gives you some of the daughter virtues, what it calls daughter virtues, right? So those practices that are actually related to the primary virtue. It gives you an opposing trait, and then it gives you a way to cultivate. One of the other things it does is you can't see it here, but it gives looks like and sounds like by grade level. So it'll say, what does affability, which is kind of a big word, but what does affability look like to a kindergartner? And then it'll give you a little looks like. What does it look like to an 8th grader, right? And you can use a little more maybe advanced language to describe that. So it does a good job of showing you what that looks like, sounds like, and sounds like at grade level, in an age appropriate kind of way. And you'll see that a lot of these words, courtesy, generosity, gratitude, kindness, loyalty, these are things that you probably already foster and promote in signage, in language, in communication, right? In all the ways we talked about. You may not realize that these are all related to the virtue of justice. These are daughter virtues to the primary virtue of justice. And so making that connection for students and for ourselves is important. Their website also has a number of teaching ideas, virtues of the week in practice. I know this is something that you do already. It has some resources about cultivating the language of virtue, which is something we're talking about, right? Virtues in language arts, virtue norms and expectations, and so on. So they have a lot of good resources here. These are just some more. Again, I'm not here to promote any particular program or system. This is just one I'm familiar with, and these are all free that you can get from their website. Remember we talked about signage. This is from my own kids' school. They just put it up. They put up language. They put up examples. You see on the top right, you see the chart that I was talking about. They put it up everywhere so that everybody can see it. They incorporate it into their assignments. This is from a social studies or a history lesson where students were asked to take a figure from American history and reflect on and write about the extent to which they do or do not live or did not practice virtue, and if they did, which virtues they practiced and why. There's a lot you could do from American history with that, obviously. Here's some more examples. Okay, we mentioned discipline. Here's an example of a positive affirmation. So this came from you'll see this was back in October. My son's teacher's name is Sister Mary Margaret. She's a Dominican of the order that created this content. So again, this is second nature to her. But we got this, he came home with us, and Leo was reverent, still, and focused during our end of the day prayer. Reverence is related to the virtue of faith, and it's related also to the human virtue of justice, giving to people what is owed to them, starting with God. And so this is a great way to affirm and foster virtue. You don't have to send home a certificate. I mean, parents love to get positive emails about their kids. Let's be honest. Unfortunately, as teachers, one of the only times we communicate with parents is when something's wrong, right? The more we can communicate with them about things that are going right with our kids, the better. And who knows, you may even win ice cream for a kid that day. Leo got ice cream. This actually, I think he got In-N-Out burger, but for bringing this home. But and he might remember that for the rest of his life, right? He might hang on to that. You never know. So those positive affirmations go a long way. And of course, incorporating it into the need for correction. So we were doing a session on Zoom last spring with Sister John Dominic from the Dominican Sisters on virtue. And literally in the middle of that session, we had 700 teachers on the Zoom. In the middle of that session, I got an email from my son's teacher, same kid, Leo, with an email that said, Leo failed to practice some of our classroom rules. And he told us, what happened. And then at the bottom, he said, here is some virtue language that I use in class that you might want to use as a parent in talking to your child about this. And this is great because it helps parents. It gives parents a language to talk to kids in a way that reinforces what's going on in the classroom. So it really fosters that parent-teacher partnership. Again, the same is true of positive affirmations, right? And those don't take time at all. You could probably choose one kid a day and fire off an email from your phone as you're walking out to your car to a parent. So-and-so practiced the virtue of circumspection today. Great job. And that kid's going to get ice cream or In-N-Out or whatever, right? You just made everybody's day. So it works really well here. This is from when my kids were in kindergarten. This is Henry when he graduated from kindergarten, and he's in 7th grade now. And you notice he's wearing a little paper crown with some gems on it. And this was what they called the virtue crown. So as kids practice the virtues, if the teacher notices I'm practicing one of the particular virtues, they'll make a note of it, and then at the end of the year they put these crowns or gems in their crown for graduation, and pretty much all the kids at some point earn a virtue gem, and they put it in the crown as the crown of their kindergarten year, and it's a very simple and cute way to foster the virtues and to show them that virtue reflects you're being made in God's image, right? So this is a great way to incorporate it into something like kindergarten commencement or whatever you call it. Athletics is another great way to integrate the language of virtue and the practice of virtue. You can't be good at athletics without practicing some of the virtues. This is from a program called Virtue Equals Strength. If you want to kind of write this down, and they offer things like posters for each of the virtues that you can put in classrooms and locker rooms. They suggest ceremonies that integrate the language of virtue into things like athletic ceremonies. So for example, I coach my son's 7th grade basketball team at the school, and we have an awards assembly at the beginning of March. And one of the things I try and do is not just give awards like MVP or most improved, but when I'm explaining the awards and giving it to them, I always try and make sure that it reflects the language of virtue that they're hearing in the school. Some other examples of resources for you. Again, I'm not here to promote any particular program. These are just examples that are out there. So again, to close here, we might think God wants obedience to a set of rules. What he really wants is people of a particular sort. And we have to be intentional about how we do this, because how we do anything is how we do everything, right? It has to be a habit. We have to be continually and intentionally doing it. Okay. We're going to give some time for some questions if you have any, but I want to point out that there is an exit ticket here for you. And if you have a phone, you're welcome to start it here now if you can see that QR code on the screen. And it just asks you 4 questions. Only the first 2 are required. The rest are optional. And you do not have to put your name if you don't want to. Something that you already do that you can align to the language and practice of virtue. Maybe something stood out to you, as I've talked a little bit here today. What's one area, though, that you'd like to intentionally work on aligning to the language and practice of virtue? Was there anything you heard where you're like, I don't know if I do that. I'd like to be better at that. Is there anything you heard today specifically that you want to implement right away? Whether it's, changing the way your discipline communication works, whatever that is. If there's something you took from today, again, that's optional. Go ahead and include it there. And if you have any questions, go ahead and include them there. I shared a link to this with Nick, so you can continually respond to this. This can become sort of like a crowdsourced, brainstorm on virtue integration, on what you're already doing, on what you'd like to work on what you've picked up, and about things you have a question about. So this is something that hopefully becomes a little bit of a living resource for all of you to continue to have that conversation amongst yourselves, which is the most important. Okay. Before we give some time to questions, here's what you're going to do with the Post-its. And you can do this as you leave. You can do it on your own. You can do it before you leave, whatever. On each of those Post-its, on the back of it or at the bottom, wherever there's space, write down the 1 or 2 word trait, quality, or disposition. Maybe you're already thinking ahead and thinking of a virtue that describes someone who does the thing you wrote down on the Post-it. So for example, if you said, I'm proud of our students when they are, or when they share a pencil with someone, I don't know, something small like that, right? What is the trait, the 1 or 2 word trait, quality, or disposition that describes someone who does that, who shares pencils with their friends? You might say it's someone who is generous, right? Well, as we saw, generosity is related to the virtue of justice, giving to someone what is due to them. So again, you probably have already affirmed your students for doing something like sharing. You're already doing that. So just align that action, align that language to the language of justice. You see somebody doing that, and you can say, you know what, John, Sally, you're practicing the virtue of justice by being generous. And then what you're going to do with all of those, and Nick, this is kind of maybe what you were thinking, at some point, align each of those actions and qualities to the particular virtues, whether that's the 7 main virtues. If you're already talking about daughter virtues, that's great. One way to do this, and this is just a suggestion, maybe at a future faculty meeting, maybe later today, you could put on a whiteboard or on big Post-its each of the 7 virtues, and then take those Post-its and align them to the virtue that each of the things you wrote down represents. That makes sense. You don't have to do that right now, but it's an activity maybe to do at some point. Okay. Okay, and I also put my contact information here. If you want to talk more about this, I'm happy to feel free to reach out. We have, I think, just a couple minutes. If there are any questions, I'm happy to hear them. Thank you for your time, by the way. Any questions, comments?
Anyone have questions? Brandon, Harris, you want to shout? Comments?
Corrections. I'm open to correction as well.
Do you have any recommendations on like best practice approaches for integrating virtues like in our own lives? For example, picking 2 and becoming proficient with those before moving on to others, or how, what would be the best approach for integrating?
That's a great question. Well, Lent is coming up. Lent begins next week, right, on Ash Wednesday. So it's a good opportunity for you to grow in any virtues that you find might be lacking. But how to do that and how to identify those. The first is to identify them. It's also really important to identify the virtues that you that are sort of second nature to you. You know, everybody. This is true both of the theological virtues and of the human virtues. As grace builds on nature, I look at my kids, and each of them excels in particular virtues and struggles with others, and that's true of everyone. That's really important for you to know, because grace builds on nature. And if you don't know those things that you're naturally attuned to, that you naturally habitually do well, then you're going to miss opportunities to grow in grace as well, right? You're going to miss opportunities to grow and use those gifts. Similarly, if there are things that you tend to struggle with in terms of habits and virtues, you might miss opportunities to ask for help from others, or you might miss opportunities to redirect yourself toward virtue. So this is really important. One thing that I would recommend, the Dominican sisters, again, I'm not here to promote any particular product, but you asked, it's a resource. They have a survey called, I think it's called Virtue. It's something like Virtue Survey, or I can find it and send you a link to it. But it's basically a survey that helps you identify those areas, those virtues that you are already most, attuned to in your own life, and the ones maybe where you need that you need to work on a little bit. I would strongly recommend that all of you do that as a faculty, because you're gonna see some things in yourself where you're like, oh yeah, that's true. I do need to work on that, or I do struggle with this, and you're gonna see ways to integrate that with your students. But I would recommend taking a look at that, and again, I'll send Nick the link to that, and doing it for yourself, even if you only do it for yourself as a personal exercise going into Lent. All right, and then taking a look at like how to foster that virtue. So again, that chart from the Dominican sisters shows you, how to cultivate the virtue. How do you practice gratitude? By living simply. The less you have, the more grateful you tend to be for the things you have, that kind of thing. And if you can incorporate that into your Lenten practices of prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, even better. So great question. That's a great question. Any others?
Ryan, we are currently revising our student learning expectations or grad at grad. We're going through some different iterations here during our self-study process. I've always been very attracted to those cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude. However, I think I'm a little intimidated by just the words themselves, as in like, wow, temperance or prudence, like what does that, like how do we make that relevant to a prospective family who doesn't have any language related to virtue or faith or whatnot. But would you recommend, like, is that something that we just need to get over and just lean into language and be very intentional, or do we modify what those virtues are based on our school context?
I think it's really important to just use the language. I think at first, the introduction of any new words will seem maybe a little foreign, but the more you start to use them, the more they become part of your culture and vocabulary. The problem, the reason I would suggest not sort of using other words is because we do live in a culture that has been greatly informed by Judeo-Christian culture and history, but it also takes certain words and changes the meaning of them slightly, right? So even a word like justice doesn't quite mean the same thing to maybe someone who is a person of faith versus someone who's not, or outside of a Catholic setting. It has a particular meaning. And so I think the four, in fact, again, I'm not trying to turn you into presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary School in Sacramento, California, but my own kid's school does this. They actually base their ISOs around the four human virtues, and then they for each of those sort of four pillars, they give a grad description of what it means for someone to become the kind of person that lives that way. So they build that language into their ISOs. You could use those as the pillars, and then identify looks like, sounds like for grad at grad in a different way. I mean, but I wouldn't shy away from using the language of virtue, because language really is a driver of culture. It's one of the main drivers of culture, and it may seem a little strange, but it also gives people, that's why giving them examples, pointing it out, giving them looks like, sounds like that are age appropriate is really important, because they need to learn this, right? If you water it down, it's going to become really vague, and you're going to end up over a few years left with something like gospel values. Like I can't stand that phrase. You see it in every mission statement in every Catholic school. It's so bland. It's not defined. No one knows what it means. I have a master's degree in theology. I have no idea what gospel values means. I've never heard that ever, but everyone uses it as if it's like this observable thing. So you don't want to water things down, because it's going to get vague and unmeasurable over time. And it is the language of our tradition. It's the language of human flourishing in the Catholic worldview. So Don't shy away from it, but definitely give people what they need to understand and see it. What else? If you want to write down the name of that survey, it's called Virtue Quest, with no E at the end of virtue. So VIRTU Quest. It's called the Virtue Quest Strengths Survey. And I'll share a link with Nick.
Sounds like a good way for us to kick off Lent next week. Yeah, one more time, just for Ryan, his time. This is exciting. This was, we have so much to build on from this, and we've got sticky notes that we can use, and we'll probably share your exit ticket maybe in another setting, just give us time and space so we can think about it and talk about it. But thank you, Ryan. You're an excellent resource. Thanks for, San Francisco is not Seattle, but go Sonics and go Seahawks.
Thank you. One thing real quick for the exit ticket, maybe just a suggestion, you don't have to do this, because it doesn't record your name, and the name is optional. So if you want to, again, use this as sort of like a crowdsource for like, here's what I'm doing, here's how I'm doing this, and you can learn from each other. Print this QR code and just put it in the faculty room. And then anytime something comes to you, anytime, like if you notice something, you put something in to practice, you can, just pull out your phone and add it to the form, which links, as you know, to a spreadsheet, right? So you'll have sort of a crowdsourced resource for yourselves of things you're already doing. So that might be a good practice. Good.
Thank you, Ryan. Take good care.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day. Thank you.